Alright, so episode 2 of Design versus Desire. Now I don't want to make this video too long. I don't want it to feel like I'm trying to lecture you on something about the game. But I do want you guys to critically think about something for a minute. Everyone complains about build diversity. At least most people complain about build diversity. And not just the fact that you can't build certain things, but the fact that things are useless, or at least some builds just don't have a purpose in the game. In this episode in particular, I want to focus on the factions. And you may not think, like, how do the factions have anything to do with build diversity? If you look at other RPGs, the vast majority of them have factions that actually mean something. So if you have a fire faction or an ice faction or a water faction or, whatever, those factions have native defenses against that stat, or they have specific strengths to other stats, right? So if you have, fire damage and you're fighting a lava monster, you're not going to be doing much damage, right? There's no point in using it. And in some games, if you're using fire on a fire creature, you're going to end up healing them. In the Division, they've basically designed it so that they didn't want to have any mechanics that limited the ability of the player. And basically the idea behind that was that anybody would be able to use anything at any time. As we see, all this does is encourage the best in slot mentality, and that is it. Now, obviously, you can't really get away from best in slot for everything. But if you actually improved your factions and made them play more like their storyline or more like the lore that they're based off of indicates, then you might be able to actually encourage some diversity, at least when you're fighting different factions. So let's just look really quickly at a Grineer Trooper from Warframe. Now, you may not play Warframe, and this may be completely foreign to you, but basically the general idea is that certain effects, like certain weapon damage types, do not work very well on them, and others do. Others work very well on them. And what it does is it encourages you to use different weapons or different things on these types of enemies. And they also deal certain types of damage. So if you wanted to protect yourself better against certain enemies or certain mobs or certain bosses, you would increase the amount of that type of armor or that type of defense that you have. Now, I think something like this could be easily implemented in the Division. And maybe not Division 2, but in the franchise in the future if that happens. Now, obviously we all know the cleaners, we all know, the big heavy. But when you're fighting the cleaners, besides for them having some flamethrowers, they don't really feel like the faction of fire. I mean, they can be burned very easily, even though they're wearing, mostly burn-resistant suits and stuff like that. I mean, they're all in these buildings that they're setting on fire. But they don't have any sort of resistance to fire. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Why does the game not purposefully encourage the use of fire resistance when you're fighting this faction? I mean, if this faction is the embodiment of fire in the Division, and yet you don't even need to use fire resistance when fighting them, why would you ever use fire resistance at any time ever? It becomes a useless stat if there's no reason to use it. If this faction cannot encourage you to use it, why would you touch it? So what I would like to see in the game is an actual reason for certain stats to exist, for certain factions to do things. And then, of course, just the ability to actually learn about the enemy itself, right? I mean, I think that's something that's missing from the Division. And that's part of the reason why there's so much confusion in the game. Because they are very terrible at explaining things, and they're very terrible at just giving you the information about everything in the game. For a game that really wants people to understand, they go to great lengths to basically make everything really, really dumb. To make everything really, really simple, yet they completely fail at actually explaining things. And I think if they actually had some sort of codex in the game for a Division, that would help a lot of players. And then you could actually understand what you want to use against certain types of enemies. This would just benefit most people. Now back on the topic of the factions. If factions actually play according to their own lore, according to their own storylines, and have strengths and weaknesses based on that, like, a military organization like the Black Tusk actually plays in a military manner where they actually support each other, guard each other, and basically defend each other, and, don't make stupid things where they're just standing out in the middle of nowhere just shooting. Yeah, then, you know what? I would feel that the Black Tusk is actually an elite organization. Because they should be able to shoot, they should be able to throw grenades accurately, and they should play like a special ops unit. They shouldn't be playing like garbage. Whereas the outcasts would be doing these crazy weird things that you just don't see in combat. You would not see people just running around like this. And that's something I would expect from a very chaotic group, right? I mean, I would not expect them to be sitting in cover. I would not expect them to be, playing by all the military tactics and all the rules. They would be doing whatever they can, and that's it. They would be acting like idiots. And that's what I expect from the outcasts. That's more or less what I expect from the hyenas. I mean, they're hopped up on drugs. I don't expect them to be hiding in cover. I expect the hyenas to act like they're invincible and basically just ignore cover and just run around like they're high all the time. That's what I expect. For other factions, I think it's a bit of a mix. But here is the issue. If you don't encourage this actual playstyle, if you don't encourage the player to incorporate some of the lore into fighting them, then all the fights kind of feel the same. And that's pretty much the issue that we're in now. I mean, you run through every freaking mission with the exact same build. And it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter what faction you're fighting, you just run the same thing. The only time there's even difference now is if you're fighting the Black Tusk. And that's generally only for like legendary or heroic missions, where you tend to use EMP. But besides for that, you really don't use anything different. I mean, it's not like you can't use Seekers on any specific faction. It's not like you can't use a turret on any specific faction. It's not like you get a specific advantage for using this or this over a different faction. And the only reason we really use EMP on the Black Tusk is just because they have a slight amount of different deployables than, you know, the other factions do. They have more deployables, so we use EMP to disable them. That's it. But besides that, there's no real benefit. And if you look at the classic RPG formula, generally speaking, the Black Tusk should be one of these organizations that has a lot of resistances to a lot of the player abilities, that can counter a lot of these things. You know, they can counter some bullet damage. They can counter some of your skills. They have, you know, explosive resistance. They have burn resistance. They have shock resistance. You know, that would be the classic trope that we would see with the Division's Black Tusk. But we don't see that, because the game wants to keep everything so simple and easy that it doesn't really develop these factions very well. And instead, what it relies on is the tankiness of the enemies. And tankiness, as we've all pretty much identified, is not the most fun way to play a game. It is not fun to fight an enemy when you can unload 2 or 3 clips into their head and they're still walking at you. I mean, it is not fun to fight the Terminator every single time you're shooting at an enemy. Now I know, with TU10 they're going to be buffing the weapon damage, and that should, you know, lower time to kill and all that stuff. But this is going to become the constant issue. They're going to raise health, lower health, raise health, lower health, and it's just dumb. If you want a challenge, then you need to understand that you can't just have a challenge based on tankiness, right? And if you read some of the past patch notes where they're talking about, oh, we removed a weird mechanic from this AI, or these guys were doing this thing, and it worked. You know, these tactics that weren't supposed to happen made the game difficult. The problem was that when they did these things, they were just too tanky to actually be able to be killed, and you couldn't fight them properly. If the enemies were actually encouraged to do weird things that the player didn't expect all the time, the game would be difficult. And it wouldn't need to rely on overly buffed NPCs to actually fight properly. And while I do understand that this is an RPG, and I do encourage some level of tankiness to the enemies, at least specific ones, enemies should have the ability to be tanky for many different reasons. And if that means that they are resistant to a player's, fire damage or explosive damage, or they have specific tactics or skills themselves that limit the effectiveness of players' bullet damage. Because if all you do is just buff up their health and armor, this naturally reduces the effectiveness of specific abilities and specific weapon types. Conversely, if we look at the damage types that the enemies do, if we look at the tankiness of the player, if a player can't counter a specific enemy, then they can't really be a tank. And this is what we see. It doesn't matter how much health you give to the player, I mean, unless it's an exorbitant amount that's just insane and breaks a lot of the rules of the game. However, if the cleaners did fire-based damage in pretty much the majority of their encounters, then having a tank who is actually equipped with fire resistance would make them a tank. So what I'm getting at is, if you actually design these factions around specific strengths and weaknesses, what you can really do is just cut out the overpowered nature of a lot of the mechanics in the game. Because as of now, for something to be effective, it needs to be overpowered. It needs to be really strong to deal with the enemies in an effective manner. If it's not, it basically gets put in the back burner and it basically gets thought of as trash. If each faction has its own uniqueness and basically requires the player to use something a little bit different, then that basically just cuts down on the ability for something to be used all the time. So if certain factions had explosive resistance, you wouldn't need to nerf Seeker Mines because they wouldn't be effective against every situation. If a faction like the True Sons had native crit chance resistance, then you wouldn't have to worry about the OP nature of crit DPS builds. And you wouldn't have to worry about people using them for every single fight. You might need to use headshot DPS builds. You might need to use just general DPS builds. Encouraging the dynamics of the actual game does not hurt the game. Encouraging these dynamics helps the game. It creates the need for different build types. It prevents things from being too overpowered all the time, every time. Because that is one of the biggest problems with the game. For something to be effective, it needs to be strong. And if it is strong, then it works against everything. And if it works against everything, then basically just the balance of the game is thrown out of whack. To some degree, players should be required to use specific things in the game. You should not just go from start to finish using these same exact tactics all the time, every time. There should be some sort of thought process behind the actual game itself that rewards players for fighting in the appropriate manner. And there should be some sort of mechanic there that punishes players for playing inappropriately. But at the heart of it, there should be an explanation of why this is right and why this is wrong. The enemy faction that is fire should show you, we are using fire, you want fire resistance. But either way, that'll do it for me, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
I thank you, my guys thank you, and the people of New York fucking thank you. I'm on my way back to the base with an escort. Let's talk when you get there.